So again, welcome, Andres. I appreciate your time. If you can do a quick introduction for us, that would be fantastic. And we'll take it from there.
Yeah, thank you, Hal. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Andres Rapela. I'm with Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, and I am actually part of an organization enterprise-wide at the Fed, Federal Reserve Financial Services, and specifically the payments improvement function within financial services. And I've been with this function focused on security and fraud improvements in the U.S. payment system for about 5 years now. Prior to that, I got financial services experience for about 20 plus years in all aspects of risk compliance related technology, as well as financial systems delivery.
Excellent. Well, thank you again for joining us today. And I know you've been working diligently on a fraud classifier, as you called it. And can you tell us a little bit about what that is and really how it came to play?
Sure, absolutely. So the fraud classifier model for payments is actually an approach to classifying fraud in a consistent manner to help foster common language around fraud communications and assessment of fraud, fraud reporting. The way that came about is we actually, back in 2018, 2019, took a moment at the Fed to take a look at aggregating a complete picture, a holistic picture of fraud in the U.S. payment system, specifically focusing on ACH, wire, and check. And when we went through that exercise, we found it difficult to pull that picture together. And part of the reason we found it difficult is organizations in the payment industry actually classify fraud differently. They define fraud differently. And therefore, you're trying to aggregate apples and oranges, right? And so we found there was an opportunity to bring the industry together and collaborate on how to improve that type of effort. And we ended up creating a working group, a collaborative working group that consisted of organizations of all types in the U.S. payment system, large financial institutions, medium, small, payment processors, fraud service providers, data analytics organizations. And of course, we had NACHA in the clearinghouse also participating with us. And we embarked on this journey to help create consistent definitions of fraud related to payments. And in the process, we determined that the definitions alone would be insufficient and we should put them in some kind of context. And that's how the model came to be. It relates these terms, and the model is really intended to help the user of the model classify fraud by guiding the user through a set of questions that ultimately result in a concatenated classification that defines the fraud. And it's meant to be payment agnostic. It's meant to be truly focused on describing how the fraud was executed.
Excellent. And I know recently lines have been blurred on different fraud types, right? If you think about some of the new attack vectors that are out there, sometimes they look like first-party fraud, sometimes they look like third-party, and they are starting to blur together in my mind of scams and how they're being perpetrated. Can you give some examples on your side of when you were doing some of that due diligence and early on gathering, what were some of the examples that you saw of Bank A having a misclassification versus Bank B? Maybe not it was their interpretation, so maybe it wasn't a misclassification on their side, but maybe inconsistencies. Some examples that you saw on your side would be great to understand.
Sure, absolutely. So first of all, there is no such thing as misclassification, right? Because we didn't really make an assessment of right or wrong as to how the industry was classifying fraud and defining fraud. But we did recognize that there were certain terms being used in the industry that meant different things to different organizations and different people. And you probably gave the best examples right there in terms of first party, third party. So we made a conscious decision as a collaborative industry group And there was about 20, 22 people, different organizations represented in this group. So we had a good set of lenses from different directions, right? To stay away from those types of terms that already were being used in the industry and truly try to define it from a clean slate type approach. And so that example of first party, third party, what we found when we built the model is that there were many alternative approaches to how to start the classification process. And we found that many organizations were coming at it through the lens of the payment type or through the lens of the type of fraud. Is this commercial fraud? Is this consumer fraud? Is it first party fraud? Is it third party fraud, right? And ultimately where we arrived at is we should really focus on the initiation of the payment and who authorized the payment, the initiation of the payment. And that brought us to basically a bifurcation of the model where from that first question, who authorized the payment, you go to either the authorized party or the unauthorized party. And this is an area where we got into some of the nuances of the definitions in the industry, right? Historically, the industry has looked at unauthorized party initiated payments as the classic fraud. What we found through these conversations is that authorized party initiated payments many times relate to fraud. For example, first party type fraud, where the authorized party initiates this payment with the intention to defraud, and then ultimately may claim that they didn't receive a product or service that in fact they did receive. So that's an example, where there were different points of view. Another, an important one, and what I think is probably one of the most valuable aspects of the model, is when the authorized party is manipulated in some way to initiate the payment. So you mentioned scams before. Another example of this might be business email compromise, where a company's executives' email is either spoofed or compromised in some way, and then used to request a payment with some urgency from a company employee, right? Basically, as an imposter of the executive. So these types of fraud, right, where there was a lot of debate with the group in terms of, is this payment fraud, right? The payment system worked as designed. A payment was initiated and it worked as it should.
Right. It looked normal.
Is it payment fraud?
Yeah.
And there was a lot of debate, and ultimately the group decided that it actually was very important to include that type of fraud in this holistic view of payment fraud, or fraud related to payments, I should say. And scams is a good example. Romance scams or product and service scams, where the fraudster somehow through social engineering or other means basically coerces or manipulates the authorized party to initiate that payment, and ultimately that payment is delivered to an account that's in control of the fraudster, and there's no returned product or service. There's no value to the payment initiator.
It really does matter, right? You've talked a lot about the benefits of why to classify this. We're all on a common page. Now, you've made a lot of progress. What are additional steps that organizations can take to continue on in solving this challenge, right? So, and my thought here is that if you don't classify it, you don't know how to fight it, right? And it becomes very hard if you're not sure what it looks like. How do organizations take that next step?
No, that's exactly right. I mean, if you don't see it, if you don't have the data, then you can't really build up your defenses appropriately, right? And so the timely gathering of that data and the completeness and accuracy of that data is essential to help inform your fraud prevention, fraud management strategies, in essence. And actually that raises another important point, right, about a common language. is that to the extent that you have a common language, then you can share information. And you can share information in a manner that organizations understand each other and they're talking, apples to apples, right?
Yep.
So in that type of sharing can help enable the prevention of certain frauds that move from one organization to the other to be stopped, right? And to force sort of the fraudsters to rethink, their strategy, right? So that's always a win.
Well, Andres, thank you very much for taking a few minutes out of your day today. Appreciate all of your time and your thought and the leadership that you've been handling in the last few years in the industry. And once again, thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for all the good work.